My name is Hajime Fujioka, and I was born to fly. Not in the poetic sense, like some cursed soul destined for the skies, but in the literal Japanese, state-mandated sense. I was molded, refined, and sharpened by the empire for the cockpit. By the time I was 21, I was already a commissioned officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. By 23, I was preparing to strike the most powerful fleet in the world. It was autumn 1941 when I first flew the Mitsubishi A6M0. I can still remember the feeling, how the wind kissed the fuselage as I cut through the clouds over Yokosuka Naval Airfield, the ocean flashing like a mirror below. The Zero was light, agile, and beautiful, like a falcon bred for war. We believed it would carry us to victory, a sword borne by the sky. I had grown up in Kawago, north of Tokyo, a merchant's son. My father sold paper and lacquer. He had hoped I would inherit the shop, but I was drawn more to engines than ink. I loved the precision, the roar of combustion, the smell of oil and ozone. When I joined the Naval Academy at Itajima, he was furious. When I graduated, he said nothing. But I caught him once, polishing the insignia on my cap when he thought I wasn't looking. They trained us to fly, but more importantly, they trained us to believe that the Emperor was divine, that our cause was righteous, that the Americans were decadent and weak, and that if we struck first, struck hard, we could cripple them before they ever woke. I believed some of it, not all, but enough. By late November, we were told our unit, Air Group 1, would deploy from Akagi, one of the 6 aircraft carriers steaming toward Hawaii in secret. Our target, Pearl Harbor. They gave us sealed orders. We weren't to open them until we were far into the Pacific. Inside mine was a map, a list of primary targets, and a small white flag with a red circle. "Do not return with dishonor," our flight commander, Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, told us. "This mission will wake the world." I remember standing on the flight deck on December 7, 1941, just before dawn. The ocean was black, endless. I tightened my gloves. My mouth was dry. There was no talk, just the wind, the humming of the engines warming up, and the smell of aviation fuel and salt. "Tora! Tora! Tora! That was the signal! We launched in waves, 183 aircraft in the first. My Zero cut through the dawn like a knife, the rising sun at our backs, the sky ahead painted with the promise of fire." As we approached Oahu, I saw the harbor appear through the clouds, the American battleships lined up like cattle at slaughter. Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California. Our bombers dove, and I watched explosions bloom across the water like deadly lilies. I strafed Wheeler Field, hit a hangar, circled back, caught a line of aircraft, still grounded. The gunners were slow to respond. Some didn't at all. The smoke was so thick it felt like flying through a volcano. I saw a pair of American pilots scramble for cover. One of them turned and fired a pistol at my Zero. I didn't shoot back. I don't know why. Maybe because he looked young. Maybe because for a moment he reminded me of myself. When we returned to the carrier, the deck crew cheered. We had lost 29 aircraft. The Americans had lost over 2,000 men. But I remember Itaya's face. It was calm, grim. He knew. We had woken a giant. For weeks, the newspapers screamed of victory. "Great blow to the Americans," they read. Tokyo rang with national pride. Civilians bowed to us in the streets. I was awarded the Order of the Golden Kite, 5th class. My father shook my hand and called me a son of Yamato. But in private, I began to dream of fire, of wreckage, of a harbor drowning in black smoke. I'd wake in my bunk, soaked with sweat, the sound of gunfire still ringing in my ears. In February 1942, we began striking targets across the Pacific. Rabaul, Wake Island, the Dutch East Indies. It was all fast, clean, one-sided. We dominated the air, but something gnawed at me. Not guilt, not exactly, it was distance. We flew above the suffering, we bombed, strafed, retreated. We saw explosions, not corpses, flames, not faces. It was too easy to forget what war meant to those below. Until April, when the Americans struck back, Doolittle's raid. Just a handful of B-25s launched from the USS Hornet, bombing Tokyo, Yokohama, and Nagoya. The damage was minimal, but the message was not. We were not invincible. By May, I was reassigned to the carrier Kaga, preparing for a new operation in the Central Pacific. The mission was secret, but the scuttlebutt was clear. We were heading toward Midway. Another decisive strike, they said. Another surprise. Another wake-up call for the sleeping Americans. I thought of the harbor. I thought of the boy with the pistol. I thought of what it meant to fly for an empire that believed in glory more than mercy. I still believed in Japan. They called the Pacific the Empire's shield. But by the time we sailed from Hashirajima anchorage in early May 1942, it felt more like a veil, one we were beginning to see through. And what lay beyond was not fear-struck Americans, but something harder, sharper. A storm was building. After Pearl Harbor, we had swept across the Pacific like a wave. Rabaul, Singapore, Java, Manila. The Americans, the British, the Dutch, they fell back faster than they could regroup. It was as though we truly were what the newspapers said, unstoppable. But the battle at the Coral Sea changed that. I wasn't there. My squadron had been held in reserve aboard Kaga, preparing for Operation MY, the planned assault on Midway Atoll. But we listened to the radio broadcasts with tightening jaws. The Americans had intercepted our invasion force. For the first time, the battle was carrier versus carrier. Planes as the primary weapon, not battleships. We lost the Shoho, heavily damaged Shokaku, and many aircraft. But more than that, we lost the illusion of superiority. I remember standing on the flight deck the morning we received the final report. The sea was calm, but the faces of the officers were not. "What's the damage?" I asked our flight leader, Lieutenant Commander Akira Tanimoto. He didn't look at me. "Enough." The Americans had lost the USS Lexington and suffered damage to the Yorktown, but they had forced us to withdraw. It was a tactical draw, but a strategic warning. We were no longer dancing with shadows. The enemy had found his rhythm. After Coral Sea, command doubled down. They wanted to draw the Americans into a trap at Midway, destroy their remaining carriers, and secure a permanent outer ring of defense. It was a gamble. And I had started to sense that our leaders liked gambling more than they liked planning. The night before we sailed, I wrote a letter to my father. I told him we were going to deliver the final blow to the American fleet, that Japan would never again fear invasion, that we would come home heroes. I folded it, sealed it, and burned it in a small tin can. It was a lie, and I didn't want it to survive me. We departed with Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the heart of the Kido Butai, our elite carrier strike force. Morale was high on paper, but in the bunkrooms, the mess halls, the galleys, we whispered. The Americans had teeth, they had skill, and they had fire in their bellies after Pearl. Still, I had my Zero. She was sleek, fast, and unforgiving. Her wings carried the pride of the Empire. I painted a red ribbon near her cockpit in memory of the friends I had lost at Tarawa and Saipan, men whose names were already fading. On June 3rd, reconnaissance planes spotted Midway Island. Bomb craters marred the runways. Anti-aircraft guns bristled like thorns. Our first strike would go in at dawn. We were told it would be routine. We had done this before, but the sea knows when blood is near. That night I cleaned my sidearm for the first time in months. Not because I expected to use it, but because something felt unfinished, like a sentence waiting for its final word. "Fujioka," said Tanimoto, entering the hangar bay where I sat beneath the wing of my plane. "Sleep. You'll need it." "I'd rather be tired in the sky than rested in the sea," I said. He smirked. "Then don't miss." At 0430 on June 4th, we launched the first strike on Midway. Our B-5N Kates and D-3A Vals flew in tight formations, with fighter escort above. I was part of the second wave in case the Americans launched a counterattack. From above, Midway was a shattered crescent of coral and fire. Our first strike hit hard, fuel tanks, hangars, gun emplacements, but we didn't eliminate their airfields. Enemy planes still scrambled. As we returned, we received orders: prepare to strike again. But then came the chaos. At around 0700, an American PBY Catalina sighted our fleet. Then came the first wave of American bombers, B-17s, high altitude and largely ineffective. But they forced us to maneuver, forced our fighters into the sky. We shot several down. It felt like control. Then came the torpedo bombers. Slow, low, brave. They came in waves. Devastators, they were called. They flew straight into death, and we shot them down in droves. It felt like slaughter. But it kept our Zeros low, busy. And then, just as the last of the torpedo bombers fell into the sea, our luck cracked. Dive bombers, dozens. SPD Dauntlesses from the USS Enterprise and Yorktown arriving from high altitude. We hadn't seen them coming. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit within minutes. Explosions tore through their flight decks, igniting fueled aircraft and bombs waiting to be loaded. From the air, I watched Kaga bloom into fire. My home, my quarters, my squadmates, gone. I radioed in, but there was no answer. Just static and screams and the crackling of a dying giant. I turned my Zero into the sun and flew east. After Midway, we no longer toasted before missions. There was still sake, sure. But the laughter that once accompanied it had disappeared, leaving behind only silence and grim habit. We poured, we drank. We stared at each other like ghosts still clinging to our flesh. I was stationed at Rabaul by the end of July 1942, reassigned to the Tainan Air Group, the most elite Zero unit in the Pacific. Our job was to defend the Japanese position in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and to support land operations against the growing Allied threat at Guadalcanal. I had survived Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway. Yet something about this jungle base made me feel more vulnerable than any carrier deck ever had. Rabaul was hot, wet, teeming with insects, and under constant surveillance by American reconnaissance. The jungle pressed in from all sides, as if the island itself wanted to swallow us. They flew often, the Americans. B-17s mostly, high-altitude bombers that dropped payloads and vanished before we could intercept. Each day brought more alerts, more scrambled flights. It was exhausting. And yet, it was nothing compared to what came next. In August, we received word that the Americans had landed on Guadalcanal, seizing Henderson Field. It was a slap to the face, a bold, direct threat to our perimeter. High Command reacted with urgency. Reinforcements were sent, air raids were ordered, and I flew nearly every day from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, nearly 600 miles round trip over endless ocean. We called it the Tokyo Express, the supply convoys that tried, and often failed, to deliver food, men, and ammunition to our embattled forces on the island. We pilots were the umbrella, tasked with protecting the transports and harassing the enemy. But the Americans were getting smarter. Their F-4F Wildcats, once sluggish and poorly coordinated, began flying in pairs, using tight formations and radio communication. They weren't better pilots than us, not yet. but they were learning. Fast. On August 24th, I was part of a strike group launched in support of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. We were to escort bombers targeting the American fleet near Guadalcanal. The morning was bright, wind light. I remember checking my oil pressure 3 times before takeoff. A bad feeling sat in my gut, low and stubborn. We encountered American fighters near Santa Isabel Island, 24 Zeros, perhaps 30 Wildcats. It was chaos, tight spirals, tracer fire, smoke trails arcing into the blue. I saw Lieutenant Nakagawa, one of our best, catch a burst to the engine and spiral down into the sea. His wing clipped mine on the way past. For a moment I lost control. I leveled out, upside down, engine sputtering, canopy cracked. A wildcat tried to finish me. His round stitched the air just behind my tail, but I dove hard, throttled forward, and fled into the clouds. When I emerged, the ocean was empty. I made it back to Rabaul on fumes, my Zero shuddering with every gust. The mechanics said it was a miracle I landed at all. I said nothing, just walked past them and sat in the mud, still wearing my flight helmet, until the rain started to fall. That night, we got word. The carrier Ryujo had been sunk. More pilots lost, more metal gone to the sea. We didn't celebrate anymore. No more newspapers praising our victories. The headlines were quiet, carefully worded. The war had shifted, subtly, then all at once. We were on the defensive. Despite all this, life in Rabaul had strange moments of levity. One pilot, Ensign Saburo, kept a monkey as a pet, smuggled from somewhere in the Philippines. The creature would sit on the fuel drums and mimic our salutes with eerie accuracy. We'd laugh. It was the only time we did. Another friend, Takahashi, made a habit of singing old-school songs before every mission. He had a terrible voice, flat and nasal, but we let him. Superstition becomes habit in war. One afternoon, Takahashi told me he'd seen a seagull while flying over the Solomons. It followed me for a few minutes, he said, like it was watching. Maybe it wanted a ride, I said. He grinned. Maybe it was a soul looking for a new body. He was shot down 2 days later. We never found his plane. The longer we stayed in Rabaul, the more men we lost. To bullets, to crashes, to disease. I watched malaria eat through squadrons as effectively as any machine gun. Dysentery, dengue fever. Our bodies decayed even as our discipline hardened. We kept flying. In October, the Americans launched a major offensive. The Battle of Cape Esperance, then Henderson Field again. Every inch of jungle was bought in blood. I flew 8 sorties that month. On my 7th, we tangled with USMC ace Joe Foss and his unit, the Cactus Air Force, they called themselves. They outnumbered us, but I managed to shoot down one Wildcat, saw the pilot bail out into the sea. I didn't fire as he floated beneath his parachute. I could have, but I didn't. By the spring of 1943, the sky itself felt tired. You could see it in the oil-slicked trails of our damaged fighters limping home, and in the sunken eyes of every mechanic dragging himself across the tarmac. The sky wasn't blue anymore. It was always some shade of gray, heavy, choking. I was stationed at Buin Airfield on Bougainville now, transferred with what was left of my old squadron. The island was remote and wet, tucked deep into the Solomon chain and pounded constantly by Allied bombers. Our food was rice gone sour. Our quarters were tents that barely held off the rain. Our days were measured in dogfights and funerals. By then I was no longer one of the eager young men from Itajima. I was 25, an officer, a veteran, a survivor. And a survivor, by definition, is someone who's watched others not survive. One by one, the names I had trained with, gone. Takayama, shot down by a B-24's tail gunner over Leh. Kuroda, vanished over the sea, never even a splash. Lieutenant Tanimoto, my old mentor, killed during takeoff when a tire burst and his Zero flipped on the runway like a beetle. The war had become a meat grinder, and our finest pilots were being fed into it by the hundreds. March 3rd, 1943, was the day I thought I would join them. The Americans had intercepted Operation 81, a convoy carrying reinforcements and supplies from Rabaul to Leh. We launched in waves to provide fighter cover. The mission would come to be known as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. From altitude, I saw the horror unfold. Douglas A-20 Havocs, B-25 Mitchells, and Beaufighters tore through our convoy with precision bombing and strafing runs. The sea was churning with flames and sinking ships. I counted more than 6 burning transports within the first 10 minutes. We dove to intercept. My wingman, Ensign Ito, got a direct burst into a B-25's cockpit, but seconds later he was ripped apart by its top turret. I saw his aircraft spin out and smash into the water. I shot down one Beaufighter and crippled another before a cannon shell clipped my right wing. My Zero lurched, engine coughing, controls sticky. I barely made it back to Buin. As I landed, the tire collapsed and I skidded off the runway, coming to rest inches from a fuel truck. When I climbed out, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped my flight gloves. I couldn't stop shaking for hours. We lost 8 ships and over 3,000 men that day. Command called it a tactical setback. We called it a massacre. In the weeks that followed, I began flying patrols over the Solomons, sometimes alone. The enemy was always there, always testing us. Their P-38 Lightnings were faster than our Zeros, hit harder, and could take more punishment. What we had left was maneuverability and desperation. There was one afternoon I remember clearly. March 21st. I was flying a solo escort over Choiseul Sound when I spotted a formation of American transports below, lightly guarded. I radioed command, no response. I had a choice, engage or observe and report. I chose to dive. I took out the lead C-47 with my cannons. It spiraled into the jungle. The others scattered. I climbed back into the clouds, alone again, but as I ascended, I was ambushed by 2 Lightnings. One caught me in the left wing. Another burst across the fuselage. I spun and dove, juked left through a cloud layer, and dropped altitude fast. By some miracle, they didn't pursue. I landed at Buka on fumes. When the maintenance crew peeled open my fuselage, they found 5 holes and half of a .50 caliber slug lodged behind my seat. I didn't talk much for days after that, didn't sleep much either. We began to feel isolated, cut off. The Americans had air superiority now, and they knew it. Bombers raided us nightly. Supply runs failed regularly. Fresh pilots arrived green and died within a week. The old-timers, like me, were asked to do more with less. I started flying reconnaissance missions. Quiet, solo flights at low altitude, nerve-wracking, but not always bloody. It gave me time to think, to reflect. I began to write again, letters I never mailed, thoughts I never voiced. I wrote about Ito, about Tanimoto, about Pearl Harbor. I wrote about the American pilot I let live. I wrote about a war I no longer believed we could win, but which I would not abandon. Because that's what loyalty was, wasn't it? Staying when the light goes out, flying when the sky falls apart, fighting not because you believe in victory, but because others believed in you. One evening in late March, I sat outside my tent watching the clouds. A pigeon landed near me. It looked lost. "Wrong front, little one," I muttered. It cocked its head and flew off again, disappearing into the smoke-tinted sky. I wished I could follow. By the autumn of 1943, we had become a fleet of ghosts. We were stationed at Truk Lagoon, once the jewel of the Imperial Navy's forward base network, the so-called Gibraltar of the Pacific. From the air, it was paradise. Coral atolls, sapphire waters, volcanic peaks cloaked in mist. But beneath its surface, the sea grew crowded with wrecks and silence. After months at Buin, I had been rotated to Truk as a veteran asset, a polite way of saying I was too experienced to waste on the front line, but too alive to be dismissed. My body still flew, but my spirit had begun to break. We had fewer planes, fewer parts, fewer pilots who returned from missions, and worse, fewer chances to matter. The Americans were advancing like a rising tide. They'd taken Guadalcanal, then New Georgia, and now they were battering the outer edges of our territory in the Central Pacific. Our grand strategy, hold a defensive perimeter and bleed them dry, was unraveling like silk in the rain. Every week, another island fell. Every week, another obituary was pinned to the board. At Truk, we still trained, still flew patrols, still made our reports, but we were waiting. We all knew it, for something to happen, something big. I kept myself busy inspecting aircraft, mentoring younger pilots, scribbling thoughts in a worn notebook. The pages were already stained with sweat and oil and regret. I no longer wrote to my father. He had stopped answering. I heard he lost the family shop in a fire after an American air raid reached Tokyo. My mother, I didn't know. I told myself she was fine. It was easier than wondering. On October 5th, our quiet was broken. The Americans struck Wake Island, bombed it mercilessly. They were testing our resolve, pushing at our defenses, and preparing, we suspected, for something greater. We were told that Tarawa, Kwajalein, and the Gilberts would be next. Our officers drilled into us the same line: hold the islands, deny the enemy airfields, bleed them on the beaches. But I had flown above too many wrecked islands. I had seen too many defenses burn. There was a young pilot assigned to me as a trainee, Ensign Shunjiro Tanaka, 19 years old, fresh out of flight school. He was sharp but jittery. He stammered when he saluted, still smelled of clean laundry and rice wine. "Sir," he asked one night over rations, "do you think we'll win?" I didn't lie. "I think we'll fight until we can't," I said. "That's all war is." He looked at me strangely. "Is that enough?" I didn't know what to say. I flew a dozen patrols in October. The sky over Truk was mostly quiet, save for reconnaissance planes. But once we tangled with a group of B-24 Liberators escorted by P-38 Lightnings. We scrambled 4 zeros. I barely made it into the air before a Lightning was on my tail. The dogfight was brutal and fast. I clipped one bomber, dodged between cloud banks, and lost sight of my squadron. For 3 minutes I flew alone, hunted, until I turned sharply and caught the American fighter in a climbing loop. I fired. I saw the P-38 spin out, flame trailing from the left engine, and crash into the lagoon miles below. It should have felt like victory. But it didn't. Back at the base, I found that Tanaka hadn't returned. His body was never found. Just an empty bunk. Just a new silence. That evening, I walked alone to the edge of the dock, stared into the Black Sea. The waves were still, peaceful, deceptive. I thought of Tanaka, of the American pilot I'd shot down, of the hundreds of men lost beneath these waters. I remembered Pearl Harbor, how confident we had been, how righteous, how blind. Now I felt nothing but weariness. There was no hate left in me, only sorrow. In the following days, I asked for fewer missions. I spent more time in the hangars, working on maintenance, studying maps. I grew familiar with names like Makin, Tarawa, Kwajalein, future killing grounds. We would be sent soon. I could feel it in the air. But before we left, I went diving. Some of the mechanics had taken up the practice to clear their minds, dive into the lagoon, swim among the coral and the wreckage. One morning I joined them. Underwater it was quiet, almost holy. I floated past the husk of a Zero, half buried in the sand. The canopy was cracked, the engine torn open like a rib cage. Fish swam through its wounds. I hovered above it, heart pounding. I couldn't tell if it was one I had flown. Maybe it didn't matter. They all looked the same in death. That night I wrote one final letter to myself. If I die, I want no shrine, no poem, just a name scratched into the wings of whatever bird replaces me. Let them fly farther, let them see clearer. I sealed it inside my flight jacket, and I waited for orders. There was no mystery in the mission. We knew Tarawa would burn. When I received my orders, I didn't even flinch. It was November, and the Americans had already landed on Bougainville. They were hopping across the Pacific like fire ants on oil paper. Every atoll became a red dot on their maps. And now it was Betio's turn. Betio, the main islet in the Tarawa atoll, had been heavily fortified by the Navy. Airfields, pillboxes, anti-aircraft guns, and nearly 5,000 Japanese defenders, all crammed into just over 1 square mile of coral. They said we'd make the Americans bleed like never before. I flew in with a detachment from Truk 3 days before the battle began. The airfield was a narrow strip of dust and wooden planks surrounded by bunkers, palm trees, and death waiting to be unearthed. We weren't stationed to stay. Our orders were to provide air support, patrol for enemy reconnaissance planes, and then, if it became clear the island was lost, evacuate the air crews or fight to the end. I stepped off the transport plane into heat and flies. Everything smelled of rot, old meat, damp wood, gun oil. Captain Ito, who had flown with me at Rabaul, was already there. His uniform clung to him with sweat and salt. "They're coming," he said. "How soon?" I asked. He squinted toward the sea. "Soon enough. The Americans always announce themselves with thunder." We didn't wait long. On November 20th, 1943, the sea exploded. The American fleet, over 17 warships and 35,000 Marines, began their assault at dawn. Battleships and cruisers rained shells on Betio for hours. The bombardment flattened trees, shattered bunkers, and peeled the shoreline like an orange. The ground shook so violently I thought the whole island might slip beneath the waves. We couldn't launch a single plane. The airfield was cratered and burning. From a sandbagged post near the runway, I watched the landing unfold. The Americans came in waves, Higgins boats and amphibious tractors, trying to reach the beach under machine gun fire. But the reef stopped them short, and many Marines had to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water. We cut them down, hundreds of them, but they just kept coming. I watched one Marine fall 3 times, bullets kicking up water around him until he dragged himself into the surf, barely moving. Another ran toward a bunker with a flamethrower. Flames spilled like liquid. Then a shell took him apart, mid-stride. By midday, I stopped counting the dead. There were too many. That night, the Americans held just a sliver of beach. Fires lit the horizon, screams echoed down the jungle paths. I met with Ito and a few others in a half-destroyed bunker. "Why don't they retreat?" someone asked. "They won't," I said. "Not now. They've bled too much to back down." Ito nodded grimly. "And we've bled too much to let them have it." Someone laughed. It was a bitter, broken sound. On the second day, I tried to launch. The runway had been patched by hand, and my Zero, an older model with a warped wingtip, had just enough fuel for a short sortie. I took off under fire, wheels barely lifting before a mortar shell slammed near the runway behind me. The engine coughed but held. Above Betio, the smoke was so thick it clung to my canopy. I circled once, spotted American landing craft unloading troops near Red Beach 2, and dove to strafe. My guns roared, I saw bodies fall. One of the gunners fired back, hit my wing, but not badly. I banked hard, coming around for another pass. That's when I saw the flag. An American corpsman was kneeling over a wounded Marine, trying to drag him back behind a sand dune. Bullets skipped all around them, but he didn't stop. I should have fired, but I didn't. Instead, I pulled up, heart pounding, stomach tight. I saw his face for just a moment, young, barely a man. He looked up at me. Our eyes met. Then I was gone, lost in smoke and sky. I landed in darkness, skidded to a halt beside 2 burning wrecks. I sat in the cockpit for nearly an hour before I moved. By the 3rd day, we knew. The Americans had taken most of the airfield. The defense lines were splintered. Our radio operators were dead. Ammunition ran low. I helped bury a mechanic with my bare hands, only to be called back 5 minutes later to reinforce a trench. We threw everything we had at them. At one point, I used a Type 100 submachine gun, scavenged from a fallen infantryman to hold off a Marine squad at close range. I shot until it clicked dry, then threw rocks, then silence. By the time night fell, only pockets of us remained. Ito was killed by a grenade. I saw it happen. He shielded 2 younger men, took the blast with his body. I didn't cry. I couldn't. On the 4th day, I found myself alone in a collapsed machine gun nest, wounded in the leg, low on water. The sky above me was quiet. No planes, no shells, just the moans of dying men and the flies gathering to feast, and the sea. Always the sea. I never thought I would see America with my own eyes, and certainly not in chains. After Tarawa, I expected execution. We had been told the Americans will not take prisoners, but instead of a bullet, I received bandages. A corpsman, the same type of man I spared in the surf, bound my leg. He never looked me in the eye. They shipped me to a U.S. Navy transport under armed guard. I limped up the gangplank as sailors stared in silence. One spat on the deck as I passed. Another made the sign of the cross. I was treated like a ghost, one who had already died, but kept walking. When we docked in Hawaii, I saw green hills, electric lights, and women in cotton dresses. I hadn't seen a civilian in months. I'd forgotten the sound of children. They moved me to a POW camp on Oahu, tucked between sugarcane fields and barbed wire. There were nearly 200 of us there, soldiers, pilots, sailors. Most of them captured in the Gilberts and Marshalls. Some had bullet wounds. Others were broken in ways no doctor could fix. We were fed twice a day. Rice, sometimes fish, sometimes canned meat. The guards were wary but not cruel. A few spoke halting Japanese. They never hit us. We were alive. And that alone was a kind of miracle. But survival carries its own weight. There was a man in our barracks named Sergeant Taro Okubo, captured after falling unconscious from wounds on Meken Atoll. He never spoke of the war, just sat by the fence each afternoon, scribbling notes in the dirt with a twig. Names, dates. Then he would erase them. "What are you writing?" I asked once. "The dead," he said. "They hate being forgotten." I began to do the same. In January, the Americans brought a translator, a Japanese-American man named Daniel Kimura. He wore a crisp army uniform and spoke with a strange accent, the vowels soft, the consonants clipped. He came to interview us one by one. When it was my turn, I sat across from him in a wooden chair, sunlight slanting through the barrack slats. "Name?" he asked. "Lieutenant Fujioka Hajime." "Unit?" "Tainan Air Group, formerly Kaga-based." He scribbled. "You flew at Midway?" "Yes." "You survived Tarawa?" I nodded. He paused. "Do you still believe Japan can win?" I looked at him. He was younger than me, born in California probably. His parents might have grown rice in Niigata. He might have cousins fighting on the other side of the Pacific. I believe Japan has already lost, I said quietly. He looked up, startled. Then why fight? I didn't answer. Not because I couldn't, but because I wasn't sure if I knew any more. In the weeks that followed, I began to speak more with Kimura. He brought us books. He played scratchy records of Enka music and even American jazz, which confused and comforted us in equal measure. We played Go in the shade of the laundry tent. He never won, but I could tell he wasn't trying. "You miss your home?" he asked once. I thought of my father's tiny shop, my mother hanging laundry, the temple bell that rang in the distance each morning. "Yes," I said, "but I also miss the sky." We heard rumors in February. The Americans had landed on Kwajalein, then Eniwetok. Every week, the perimeter shrank. I read their newspapers, borrowed from Kimura, watched the map shrink like a puddle under sunlight. One night I dreamed I was flying again, not over islands or fleets, but above mountains covered in snow. I wasn't carrying bombs, just gliding, watching the earth move beneath me. When I awoke, I wept silently into my blanket. Some prisoners turned bitter. They carved rising suns into the bunk posts, refusing to speak English or take American medicine. Others broke completely. One man tried to hang himself with a sheet. Another refused to eat until he collapsed. But I began to write. Letters I'd never send, names of friends who died, reflections on what I had seen, not for glory, not for shame, but for truth. I needed it recorded somewhere, even if it was only inside me. We were the weight Japan had cast into the sea, and now we were drifting, waiting to see if the current would ever bring us home. One day, Kimura brought me a letter. "From your sister," he said. I hadn't heard from my family in over a year. The letter was short, careful, filled with censor's ink. But it told me what I needed. My parents had survived the Tokyo air raids. The shop was gone, but they were alive. I reread it every night for weeks. Some nights, I stood near the fence, staring through the gaps in the barbed wire. In the far distance, planes flew in and out of Hickam Field, silhouetted against the dusk. American fighters, bombers, cargo planes. I could recognize every model by shape alone. Once I imagined running, leaping onto the tarmac, stealing one of their planes, and flying east, back to the Empire, back to the wreckage of a sky I had once called mine. But I didn't move. The Americans called it summer. But to me, it was the season of fire. Even in Hawaii, we could smell it. The ash wasn't in the air, but in the letters we received, in the expressions of the guards, in the way Kimura's voice changed when he read the latest headlines from the mainland. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, Kobe. Each name, a home to someone in our barracks, each city, a flame in the sky. We had little information, but we knew. The war was reaching into the heart of Japan. The Americans were no longer bombing fleets or airfields. They were burning the cities themselves. Operation Meeting House, Kimura told me. They hit Tokyo on March 9th, incendiaries. Almost 100,000 dead. More than in Hiroshima. Almost all civilians. I couldn't speak. I could only see the narrow street where my father's shop once stood, the open door, the smell of tatami mats in summer. He'd survived the first fire, but would he survive this one? The camp changed, subtly, then all at once. The guards spoke less. Their drills stopped. Food improved, slightly. Medical attention arrived quicker. There were whispers. The Americans were preparing for a final invasion, something called Operation Downfall, and they feared what they might face. I heard one GI mutter to another, "These bastards will fight with broomsticks if they have to." He wasn't wrong. If I'd been in Japan, I would have done the same. In July, they began bringing in prisoners from the Philippines. Men from Leyte, Luzon, survivors of the failed garrisons. One man, Sergeant Miyake, had burns across his arms and back. His eyes were always red. He never blinked. "We hid in a cave for 12 days, he whispered once. The sea was filled with bodies. We ran out of water, some men. They drank from the dead." He looked at me, shaking. They knew we were beaten. They just kept coming and coming. One morning in late July, Kimura came to me with a newspaper folded tightly in his hand. His expression was unreadable. He sat beside me under the shade of the canteen roof. "They tried to kill the emperor," he said. I stared. "What?" "July 20th, in Germany. An officer placed a bomb under Hitler's table. It failed. Barely." I frowned. "That's Germany." "Yes," he said. "But what happens if our officers do the same? What if Japan loses the will?" I shook my head. "They'll never stop. Not our generals, not our navy, and not our people." He looked down at the ground. "Then we may all die for an illusion." August 6th. The day the sky fell. We didn't hear it, of course. But the silence afterward was deafening. Hiroshima. The guards were quiet for hours. The radios, usually filled with swing music and sports scores, went silent. No one knew what to make of it. They said it was a super bomb, that a single plane had dropped it, that it had flattened the entire city. We didn't believe it at first, but Kimura read the report aloud the next morning. His hands trembled. "An entire city," he said. "Gone. They say people were vaporized. Shadows burned into the sidewalk. Children turned to cinders mid-step. No one spoke. We just sat. Breathing. Still alive. August 9th. Nagasaki. The second light." I remember sitting by the fence, staring at the palms, and feeling like I was the last man on earth. What were we now? A defeated people still pretending they were a nation? The next morning, one of the guards brought out a radio and let us listen. We heard the Emperor's voice. Not a speech, not an order, just a soft, trembling message. He told us the war had ended, that Japan would surrender. I wept, not for the war, not for the surrender, but because the voice of my country sounded more human than I had ever imagined. I realized, in that moment, I hadn't fought for the Emperor. I had fought for the men next to me in the cockpit, for the friends who never came back, for the honor I was told would keep me warm. But honor doesn't burn brighter than fire, and pride doesn't bring back the dead. They opened the gates a week later. We were still prisoners, but we could walk further, talk to civilians, read newspapers without censorship. I found a photograph of Hiroshima in one of them. It didn't look like a city, it looked like the moon. Kimura stood beside me. I asked him quietly, "Do you believe they had to do it?" He didn't answer for a long time. "I believe," he said finally, "they had to end the war before the world forgot how to live." I came home on a ship that flew an American flag. It was October when they released us. We were escorted in silence from the POW barracks in Oahu to the docks, where we boarded a U.S. Navy transport headed west. There were no shackles, no beatings, no parades, just the creak of canvas packs and the whispers of men who didn't know whether to call themselves survivors or prisoners of shame. When we reached Yokosuka, the port was nearly unrecognizable. The once mighty Imperial Navy base had been reduced to skeletons of dry docks, hulls rusting under ash-gray skies. The air stank of diesel and mildew, and the silence of surrender hung like smoke over the harbor. Some civilians watched from a distance, others turned away. I stepped off the gangplank carrying a satchel and a name that had no place in this new Japan. My home was gone. Tokyo had burned. Ginza, where I once walked as a cadet, was a maze of broken glass and blackened bricks. I found the spot where my father's shop once stood, now a hollow square of rubble, the charred outline of shelves visible in the concrete. A neighbor told me they died in the March firebombing. No burial, no marker. Just fire. I stood there for a long time, tracing the edge of the ruins with my fingers, as if I might feel their presence in the dust. There were no tears left, only quiet. I traveled south to Yokohama, where a cousin had survived. She lived in a makeshift shack near the tracks. She didn't recognize me at first. Too thin, too quiet, too changed. She fed me rice and miso, told me how the Americans now ran the city, how MacArthur's men walked the streets like landlords. "There's no more war," she said, almost defensively. "People are working again. Children laugh again." I tried to smile, but I felt like a man who had outlived his own world. I was offered a job of sorts, translator for the Americans. Kimura had sent my name forward, saying I had good conduct and linguistic potential, but I declined. Not out of pride. I simply didn't know who I would be if I accepted. A pilot turned into a clerk? A man who once dropped fire from the sky, now delivering mail to men who had returned the favor tenfold? Instead, I drifted. Odd jobs, moving crates, fixing bicycles. Sometimes I drew in a sketchbook, the same one I had carried as a cadet. Mostly planes. Sometimes faces I could no longer name. Once I tried to draw Ito. I couldn't remember the shape of his eyes. The streets were full of men like me, shadows in threadbare uniforms, their insignia ripped off, their medals pawned or buried. We passed one another without speaking, a generation raised to fight, and now asked to forget. I met one in a bar near Shinjuku. He had flown bombers in China. We drank together, cheap sake, bitter and hot. He said he dreamed of the sky every night, and every night he fell. I told him I dreamt of a lagoon, of the rusted wings beneath the sea. We drank in silence after that. In November I visited Yasukuni Shrine. It was mostly empty, a few elderly women praying, some students, heads bowed, the names etched into the memorials stretched longer than I remembered. Every step brought a memory. Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guadalcanal, Tarawa. I left no offering. Only a folded paper crane tucked into the corner of a stone pillar. It was the only prayer I had left. The city grew louder with time. By winter, American cars rumbled through the streets. Children carried chocolate bars. Baseball became more common than sumo. I watched a boy toss a worn glove to his friend and wondered if he'd ever know what it cost to have such a game in peace. I sat on a bench near Ueno Park and watched the crows. They perched like judges, black and solemn. I had survived, but I hadn't returned. I was still somewhere over the Pacific, caught between bomb runs and burning skies, between duty and regret. One day a young reporter approached me at a food stall. "You were a pilot, right? A veteran?" I nodded. "Would you speak about the war? We're collecting stories for the next generation." I looked at him. He was barely 20, clean uniform, clear eyes. I thought of saying no, but instead I said, "Only if you write it like it hurt." He didn't understand. Not yet. But maybe he would. It has been 5 years since the war ended, and still I wake up reaching for the flight stick. The dreams are quieter now, not fire and screaming, not falling metal, just the wind, thin and high, humming against the fuselage. Sometimes I see the curve of the Pacific below me, blue and endless. Then I wake, hands trembling, staring at the cracked ceiling of my rented room in Kamakura, no sky above, only plaster and silence. I have not flown since 1945, not because I can't, because I chose not to. After the occupation settled, Japan changed faster than I could follow. The Americans didn't just defeat us, they remade us. Factories that once built Zeros now made sewing machines. Fields became suburbs. Shrines became tourist stops. Young men wore leather jackets and greased their hair. The old emperors of the air, men like me, became relics in threadbare suits. I found work repairing bicycles, then engines, then radios. I had a light touch. Pilots learn that early. Machines speak if you know how to listen. In Kamakura, I lived in a small house above a repair shop, overlooking the sea. Some days I would walk the beach and watch the wind skim the waves, and think of the wings we once rode into the mouth of death. One spring afternoon in 1948, a man came into the shop, tall, gray-haired, foreign. "Are you Mr. Fujioka?" "Yes," I said, wary. He pulled out a crumpled photograph and showed me a black-and-white portrait of two young men in uniforms, one Japanese, one American. "I'm John Mallory," he said. "My brother fought at Tarawa." I didn't speak. He was a corpsman. Died pulling a man off the beach, one of the few who didn't hate the men shooting at him. Your name was in his journal. I looked at the photo. I remembered the beach. The medic I hadn't shot. I nodded. I remember him. John Mallory didn't ask for an apology. He only said thank you. Then he left. The guilt never goes away. It only changes shape. I used to feel it like a weight. Now I carry it like a scar, present but healed over. When I pass by shrines, I pause. When I hear a plane overhead, I still look up. I started writing in 1949. Not for others, for myself. Memories, mostly. Maps I redrew from memory, descriptions of cockpits, names of friends long buried beneath coral and ash. I kept a ledger of those I saw die, another of those I helped save. One night I wrote, "I flew for an empire that died, but I live in a country trying to be born again." It was the most honest thing I had ever written. Children play outside the shop now. They run and laugh, their wooden sandals clapping across the pavement. They know nothing of what we did to survive, nothing of what we lost. Nor should they. That is the point of survival, not to glorify it, but to end the need for it. I met a woman in the spring of 1950, Aya, a teacher. Her husband died on the Yamato. She understood silence. We sit sometimes and drink tea as the wind moves through the window. We rarely talk about the war. It hovers between us, unspoken, like incense smoke. She said once, "You carry the war like it's still going." I replied, "For some of us, it always is." I was invited recently to a ceremony at Yasukuni. Veterans, government officials, speeches about sacrifice and rebirth. I declined, not out of protest, just tiredness. Too many men were praised in those halls who should have been mourned instead. Too many were sent to die without ever being told the truth. But I walked past it, the day of the ceremony, stood outside, listened to the music, and I said a name, then another, and another. Each one, a wing lost to the wind. When I was a boy, I believed in flight as freedom. When I was a soldier, I believed in it as power. Now, as a man who has seen too much sky, I know it's neither. Flight is only motion. It is the wind moving us towards something or away from it. We choose the direction. Sometimes on clear mornings, I walk to the cliffs at Inamuragasaki and look out across Sagami Bay. I bring with me a folded kite, red and white, hand-painted with the character for wind. I let it rise into the breeze. I watch it fight, then catch, and finally drift steady into the sky. And in that quiet, with salt on my lips and the wind in my ears, I feel something I haven't felt in years. Not victory, not pride, not even peace, just presence, still breathing, still here, still flying,